This video will show you how to warp the Arras Tapestry loom and Schacht's original tapestry loom. Though we're demonstrating on the Arras loom, the same steps apply to both looms. Visit our website, schachtspindle.com, to find complete product information and to download instruction manuals. Section 1. Set up the loom. Place the tension beam halfway up in its slots. Measure both sides of the beam to make sure it is level, sitting at the same height. Remove the shedding device and set it aside on a table. Choose a warp coil. You can warp the loom with the coil installed at the front or at the back. Here we're using it at the front. If you prefer to warp from the back, you may want to install it at the back. To install the warp coil, unclip the warp set rod from the top beam. Slide the rod through your chosen coil, then clip the rod back onto the top beam. Here we're using a 6-dent coil. If you're warping with the loom in a vertical position, raise the loom up on its legs to the highest point possible. Section 2. Wind the warp. You will wind a continuous warp, repeating the path over and over. The path is the same whether you're winding from the front or the back. To better see what is going on, we will show you the process from the front and the back. To get started, tie the end of the warp yarn to the warp wedge bar. Take the warp yarn under the bottom beam to the front of the loom. Carry the yarn over the top to the back of the loom and set it down. Center the warp on the loom, which takes some simple math. The warp coil is 20 inches wide, with its center point at 10 inches. Here, we're winding a warp that is 6 inches wide. We'll divide it in half to get 3 inches. Subtract 3 from 10 and we get 7. So the starting point for this warp is 7 inches in from the end of the coil, whether you're warping from the front or the back. Place the first warp thread at the 7-inch mark. Now that we've set the starting point, pick up the warp yarn and resume the path at the back of the loom. From here, we will just follow the warping path over and over. This is really important. Warp yarn always goes around the outside of the loom. It never crosses from front to back inside the loom. The yarn always turns around on the warp wedge bar. Yarn comes down the back from the top of the loom to the warp wedge bar. Turn around on the warp wedge bar and take the yarn back up to the top. Go under the bottom beam to the back of the loom and up to the warp wedge bar. Turn around on the warp wedge bar and take the yarn down to the bottom beam and around it to the front. Now we'll start the path again. Go all the way to the top of the loom. As we keep winding, follow along on the diagram. The red lines mark one repeat of the warping path, which adds 2 warp threads. Remember, always turn around on the warp wedge bar and stay at the back of the loom when doing so. You will see a pattern develop where warp threads alternate going down and going up. It's a good idea to check your warp about every inch. Stop and wave your hand inside the loom to make sure the warp is on the outside. If you made a mistake, unwind to the trouble spot and correct it right away. Before we show warping from the back, let's consider the warp coil. You can place it on the front or the back, depending on how you prefer to warp. And each time the warp yarn passes over the coil, you'll place the yarn in the next dent. If you attach the warp coil at the front, this happens at the front of the loom as shown here. If you've attached the warp coil at the back, this happens at the back of the loom, which we haven't shown. When Jane demonstrates warping from the back, you'll see her reaching around or over the loom to put the warp yarn into the coil. Now we'll follow the warp path from the back of the loom. Again, the diagram has red lines marking each repeat. Remember to check your work frequently. All warp threads need to be on the outside of the loom. Once you've wound all the warp threads for your project, wrap the yarn around the bottom beam 3 or 4 times. This temporary tie-off holds everything secure for the next few steps. Check the warp for crossed threads on the warp wedge bar. Start at the first thread and work across the loom, checking one thread at a time. If you see crossed threads, reposition them now. Remove slack from the warp. Start at the first warp thread and pull on it to take out the slack. Now pull on the second thread, tightening it in the same way. Move across the warp thread by thread. When you reach the last warp thread, undo the temporary tie-off, remove the slack, and rewind it. At this point, the warp should be even and fairly tight in tension. You may want to work across the loom a second time to remove slack. The more even the tension, the happier you'll be as you weave your project. When you're satisfied that the warp is sufficiently tight and even, cut off the yarn and tie the end to the warp wedge bar. Raise the tension beam a little. You want tension to be firm, but not taut like a guitar string. Section 3. Set up the shedding device. Cut enough heddles for all your warp threads. When you pull the textile heddles off the spool, you'll see long loops alternating with short loops. Cut across each short loop crosswise. Here we'll make 36 heddles, one for each warp thread. Reinstall the shedding device. It is easiest to do this with the loom lying down. You can install the handle on the right or the left. Remove the O-rings from both heddle rods. Set the handle in neutral position, parallel to the risers, and slide one rod away from the handle. We're going to start with the rod on the top. Above the shedding device, use a pickup stick to pick up every other warp thread. These threads will get attached to the top heddle rod. Fold a heddle under the first picked up warp thread and slide the heddle over the heddle rod. Continue in this way along the warp, attaching each picked up warp thread to the heddle rod. When you reach a rod support, slide the heddle rod through it and continue installing heddles. Once all the heddles are installed, slide the heddle rod back into place and secure it with 2 O-rings. Slide the second heddle rod away from the handle. Now you'll add heddles to warp threads that you skipped on the first heddle rod. You may find it helpful to insert a second pickup stick below the shedding device. As you did on the top heddle rod, attach each picked up warp thread to the rod. Then secure the heddle rod with 2 O-rings. Check the shedding device to make sure all heddles are attached correctly. Remove any pickup sticks. Flip the handle up and insert a pickup stick through the shed. Every other warp thread should be lifted. Flip the handle down and insert a pickup stick through the shed. Again, every other warp thread should be lifted. Section 4. Final steps. Position the loom for weaving. You can lower and tilt it on the legs to make weaving more comfortable. Reposition the warp wedge bar. Pull the warp wedge bar out of its bumpers and push it down behind the bottom beam. If you've tightened the tension on the warp, you may need to loosen tension to move the warp wedge bar. Finally, raise the tension beam for a very firm warp tension. You want a warp as taut as guitar strings. As you weave, you'll advance the warp in this same way. Loosen tension, move the warp wedge bar, and tighten tension. And that's it. You are ready to begin weaving. Check out additional Schacht videos on our YouTube channel. You will find tutorials, projects, and interviews. You can also meet other products from Schacht Spindle Company.